Well, on this first Sunday of Advent, I don't know if all of you realize, usually we say, well, what is Advent? Well, it's the few weeks before Christmas, right? But the reality is, in the history of the church, that the season of Advent is also a time where we are reminded that the same Jesus who was born in the fragility and vulnerability of a baby laid in a manger is also a triumphant Lord who's going to return again. That Jesus Christ is going to come again. The time as we know it someday will end. And that Christ, who did come in the incarnation, who lived the perfect life, who died in my place and yours on the cross, was raised from the dead in the power of God, ascended into heaven, is sometime going to come back and make all things right. So here's what I wonder. If you ever have days where it feels like life has knocked the wind out of you, do you ever have days in your journey where you're walking in darkness and you're looking for a light to guide you? Are there ever moments where in your heart you're saying, Jesus, may it be today. Could you come back today? This world is such a tough place. The reality of the circumstances in my life today are so challenging, or my spirit is so struggling. I want you to come back. I don't know if any of you, out of curiosity, ever consult the horoscopes. Do you? You ever turn in the paper just out of curiosity? Well, let's see. I was born in April, and in the stars, according to the horoscope, it tells me I should avoid jumping on my left foot every third Thursday. Seriously, do you ever think that your destiny is somehow locked and determined by the position of the stars? Or is your destiny determined by a little one that lay in the straw underneath a star that moved in the heavens to mark the arrival of the Lord of the cosmos to our world? I think I would stake my life on the Jesus who has come. But as I said to you a moment ago, there are moments in all of our lives, I think, where it feels dark. And we wonder how we're going to continue, or where we're going to get the strength to persevere. So we come to this story of the three wise men from a far-off country, probably what would be modern-day Iraq, or Persia, as it was known in that time, the land where Daniel was, the country of Babylon, in the time of exile. And so there was the seeding of the word in that region of the world, and there are three learned men, or were they magicians, or were they rulers? We're not certain. But they saw a star appear in the heavens. So it wasn't just to go on a 2-year camping adventure. There's a prophecy in Numbers 24 that says this: a star shall come forth in Jacob, and the king's scepter will rise in Israel. So these wise magi, studying the scriptural witness, though maybe from an area of the world that very few believed in Yahweh, saw the star rise in the sky and began a journey to meet and greet the new king who had been born into the world. So as they said to King Herod, the earthly ruler of the time, we've come to greet the new king who has been born. Herod doesn't like it much. It's interesting, isn't it, that the king who has that position of power would be insecure by the identity of a baby. But he's so insecure about that identity that we know the tragedy that he had every child under the age of 2 put to death. How would you try and protect your power if somebody said, from now on, this one's in charge? So there's times where we feel threatened. We would think, wow, the audacity of Herod, where the 3 magi, or however many magi it was, come from a journey. They say, the heavens have marked the arrival of someone who sent from God to our world. And Herod says, I'm going to kill him because I want to hold on to my earthly power. I want to suggest to you that every time that you and I, in our sinfulness, resist God's right to rule over us, we're no different than King Herod. We're saying, I don't want your control in my life, God. I'm going to make my own decisions. In fact, I'm going to be the captain of my own ship. And that's my sin. There's a rebel in all of us that resists what God would say is the way he wants us to live, that defies his right to rule over us in love. So the child that is the hope of the world has arrived. It says in Isaiah, as it was read for us by Jim, the people who walk in darkness have seen a great light. There are people that I've known in my life journey who struggled with darkness. And so, where could we find hope when the world feels dark? And maybe you can relate to some of these stories, or maybe you have moments where the way you journey feels dark. I remember a woman named Angie in her early 20s. She was one of the first women who was on a tank in combat going into Iraq in the first Gulf War. She was an extremely accomplished soldier. She was very successful. But when her tour of duty was done and she returned to her little Midwest town, she had seen things with her eyes and experienced atrocities in the ending of life in a desert portion wilderness area of the world, and she didn't know who she was anymore, and she didn't know what life's purpose was. And in the middle of her darkness, she saw a star that led her back to remember the story of her childhood that now became real and the most profound truth for which she could stake her life: the birth of Jesus Christ. Or I think about Randy, who was an extremely successful businessman, a millionaire. He never had to worry about money one day in his life, and the whole of the area knew his reputation, and they respected him, and he was very involved in his church. But every day of his life, there was a cloud of blue depression that haunted him. It was like a shadow on his life. And it didn't help to just say, well, cheer up, life is good. It didn't lift the cloud. In the middle of his struggle with depression, he found a star. And the star pulled his heart into a deeper level of surrender in intimacy of relationship with Jesus Christ. And that was the only way that he had the courage and the hope to persevere in his journey. I tell you stories from Hoopole, North Dakota. Well, this is Pat. Pat inherited lots of land, and Pat inherited hundreds of thousands of dollars from his parents. He was an extremely adept farmer. And so as the years went on, Pat became a multimillionaire. In fact, by the time he died, and I officiated as a funeral, Pat owned $53 million worth of assets in the mid-'80s. But before that, earlier in his life, in the early 70s, Pat was married to Ingi. They lived in the most beautiful home in Hoople. And Ingi began to slowly lose the sharpness of her mind. And as that continued to progress, Pat was beside himself to know how to help his wife Ingi. He didn't know what to do. He felt so powerless. And one day, when they awakened in the morning, Ingi started screaming at the top of her lungs, because from her haunted perspective, she woke up in bed with a strange man that she did not know. Now, even though Pat intellectually fully understood why and what, there was a deep level in Pat's heart that was just broken. Money couldn't fix it. His capacity to be a fantastic farmer didn't fix it. He walked in darkness. His only hope was a star that brought him back to the Savior who had been born. And we might look at the Christ child lying in a manger in the moments where life knocks the wind out of us, and we might even say to God, that's not enough. But it is. The face of our Savior that's come to share our darkness is enough. Manny became addicted to drugs when he was at college. His struggle with addiction had him flunk out of college. And when he was at home, he still continued to struggle. And one day, the horror was, when he was on a high, he was so delusional that he took the life of his own brother in their home of the parents. And now, in custody, found legally insane, he's trying to figure out, how does he live the rest of his life with the truth of what has happened? Where does he find hope? Do you know where he found it? He looked to a star in the darkness that brought him back to Jesus Christ. And he reaffirmed, similar to Angie, he reaffirmed that the only hope for his life was the child that he worshiped when he was a little one. And he heard about Jesus who was born for him. One more who walked in darkness was Jenny. Jenny's daughter Stephanie was diagnosed with leukemia when she was 7. Stephanie had a canary songbird that she'd been given for her birthday, and the canary sang a song for Stephanie almost every day. She loved that bird. And in her struggle with leukemia, somehow Stephanie found hope with the song of that bird. So toward the end, when Stephanie was soon going to leave this world, the doctors and medical staff allowed her songbird to come to the hospital. But I remember how Jenny, Stephanie's mother, wanted to die herself when her daughter breathed her last. And at home, Jenny's husband struggled with alcohol and was a mad drunk, abusive. Jenny literally spent nights in the doghouse outside their home. where was she going to find hope in her grief? A star, a light in her darkness, led her back to Jesus Christ. Because you see, no matter how dark the journey and no matter how broken our human experience, no matter how unjust the unfolding of life, that's why the good Lord sent Jesus Christ into our darkness. So that even when the way is dark, we have a light to shine that we can cling to. Did their new faith or renewed faith in Jesus Christ make all the darkness dissipate? No. Did life fix itself because they profess faith in Jesus? No, the world is broken, the world is imperfect, and we as human beings are far from perfect. But we have a way to walk in the darkness. His name is Jesus. He's my hope. It's been many years now, but my mind goes often back to the story told by Corrie ten Boom in her book, The Hiding Place, in World War II. This week I remembered a story that she told about how she and her sister Betsy and their papa from Holland ended up in a German prison camp because they had been part of the Jewish underground, hiding Jews so they could escape from the threat of Nazi terror. Eventually they were turned in for helping the Jews, and they ended up in a prison camp. And her book tells the stories of the atrocities they experienced as they were in that German prison camp, how merciless the guards of the prison were, making them stand for hours out in the cold in the German winter, or in the barracks, which were double or triple the proposed capacity, that in those barracks they were jammed into their bunks and had no room, and how human nature kind of expressed itself there, how they fought lice, but how they thanked God for the lice, because then the German guards would leave them alone and not come into the barracks to violate them. Well, one day, the German soldiers barking orders and opens the door of the barracks and pushes in a whole new group of women that are from the neighboring city, that are all a part of a big brothel house, a group of prostitutes. And the women rise up in rejection. They start spitting on them. They start hurling abuse. They start flying with their fists. They start kicking these ladies. But Corrie and Betsy remembered how God says in the Word we're to be like stars shining in a dark place. So Corrie and Betsy took one young girl under their arm, and they invited her to find a place with them, and they asked her about her family, and they told her she would be safe with them, and they tried to warm her up, and they shared what little food they had with her, and they told her about how Jesus loved her. For all of us who walk in the darkness, who understand the pain of grief or brokenness or emotional woundedness or despair or moments where we wish life would stop, on those moments for any of us who walk in the darkness, who feel like life has knocked the wind out of us, we need to look again to the light of a star who brings us to the place where Jesus Christ, the Savior, is born for you. He alone is our hope.